Okay, so this is Civil Rights Part 2. This is the March on Washington. The marches and protests in Birmingham caused many Americans to support new civil rights. So all these new civil rights were gaining all these supports. Bills were being supported by people. They were being supported by Congress. And on August 28, 1963, close to 250,000 people joined Martin Luther King Jr. in the March on Washington, where they were out in front of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. It was one of the largest demonstrations in that city up until this point. The purpose of this march was to support the passage of meaningful civil rights. So the elimination of racial segregation in public schools, so schools had to be integrated, jobs and job opportunities, and other employment benefits and equality. So it was for, a lot of jobs, equal rights and jobs, because we had started slowly expanding the need for civil rights everywhere. The highlight of this event was Martin Luther King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," and this march united many groups who supported civil rights, and now President John F. Kennedy promised his support to the civil rights campaign as well. Unfortunately, on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson went to Texas to campaign, and the motorcade was going through Dallas, Texas. And as they were traveling through, there were thousands of people there on the sideline greeting him. People were standing up in buildings greeting him. But shots were fired from a distant spot and hit President Kennedy, and he was killed within the hour. So immediately following that, of course, Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, and we refer to him as LBJ since we referred to John F. Kennedy as JFK. Lee Harvey Oswald was the one that killed the president, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became the new president. JFK was unable to keep his promise to support civil rights, and since he wasn't able to keep his promise for civil rights, President Johnson, LBJ, promised to continue JFK's support of civil rights and his policies. Johnson stated that the passage of civil rights laws that were meaningful and important would be the best way to honor the fallen President John F. Kennedy. So many people began to rally around the death of JFK and the support of the Bill of Rights, and they were yearning for support of civil rights legislation. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this is the law that came out of right after JFK's death. This law banned segregation in public schools. So we had Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education and Brown 2, which kind of strongly suggested that schools integrate, but this law absolutely banned it in public places like theaters and everywhere else. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prevent job discrimination, so you can no longer be discriminated against for being African American. Segregation was now officially illegal in the United States. This was because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. No more separate places at all. It also made it illegal to use different voting standards for African Americans. So, for example, literacy tests and all sorts of things. And the 24th Amendment outlawed a poll tax. So African Americans used to be charged to vote, and of course, if they couldn't afford it, they couldn't vote. But African Americans still had trouble voting due to violence, and so people were calling for stronger voting rights laws. So the right to vote became kind of the biggest issue during the 1960s. In 1964, SNCC, the SNCC, organized Freedom Summer, which is a voter registration drive that were trying to register Southern African Americans to vote. Northern college students came to Mississippi in the Deep South to work with SNCC, and many were abused, some were killed, but many and thousands of people, African Americans, were registered to vote in the South because of this Freedom Summer movement. In 1965, Martin Luther King and the SCLC organized a voter registration drive in Selma, Alabama. In response to all the hatred and violence done against the demonstrators in those marches and stuff, the SCLC organized the March on Selma, which went from Selma to Montgomery. This march proved to be incredibly important as it was kind of a defining moment in civil rights history. At the first march, they were met by state troopers on a bridge just outside of Selma, and they were basically beaten back into Selma, and they were forced to retreat. They tried again, but were turned around when they met another set of state troopers. So they've tried to march twice, both times met by state troopers in Alabama. On March 21st, 1965, 2,000 people set out to march, but this time they were protected by the U.S. Army and the National Guard, and they reached Montgomery, Alabama on March 25th. 4 days of marching, sleeping in fields, 12 hours of walking a day. The march and the violence were captured on TV, which only gained more support for civil rights around the nation. So President Johnson eventually went to the governor of Alabama and said, "Do not lay a hand on any of these people. I need them, or they need to march. They deserve to march. They have the right to march." And he eventually signed the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965 in response of all these protests and march for voting rights. This law banned literacy tests and other laws that kept people from registering to vote. Thousands of African Americans were registered to vote shortly after that act. Board always falls. All right, so Malcolm X is another one of the famous civil rights leaders. We're not going to spend a ton of time on him, but it's important to know that he was a Muslim, and during a trip to Mecca, he saw how Muslim people treated people, all races, equally, and he felt that that was very important, and he wanted a world where everyone was equal. Him and Martin Luther King had the same goals. They wanted people to be free and to be equal. However, he did support a more aggressive stance than Martin Luther King, who practiced nonviolent fight for civil rights. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, and in 1966, Martin Luther King was protesting in Chicago, where laws were equal, but discrimination was everywhere. So maybe the laws were equal, but there was still discrimination amongst white people in Chicago. The frustration of lack of power and discrimination in the North caused a lot of people to riot. African Americans were upset that they didn't have the power and they were still being discriminated against. And you had all these race riots of Chicago, and eventually they spread nationwide. Unfortunately, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, as he was leaving his hotel room. He essentially gave his life for civil rights.